Hello, my name's Ashley. I'll be talking to you a little bit about Platonic philosophy. I am an Indigenous person from the Arakan tribe, and I can't introduce myself, but I can say thank you, so waklo, to the organizers for inviting me. It's a huge honor to be involved in Race Before Race, especially as a PhD student, and also to the staff who very kindly arranged everything, and were really nice. So with that being said, this paper is a reflection of things that I work on but haven't necessarily brought together all at once. So a lot of the passages that we'll be looking at today, I've thought of in terms of how they construct race, and specifically a Platonic construction of race, but I haven't really thought about it in terms of indigeneity, which is what I'm really interested in sort of exploring today and hoping to get a lot of your relevance. So the aim is to consider if we can generate a concept indigeneity for the ancient world, specifically the ancient Mediterranean, where that might crop up, what impacts it has on our understandings of different ideologies and philosophies, and with respect specifically for Plato today. So in particular, I'm picking up a line for the introduction of the symposium that the relationship between the indigenous peoples and their land has always been fundamental to the notion of indigeneity, so really being expansive about what relationship to the land looks like, especially when we go to a different geographical and temporal space, like the ancient Mediterranean and ancient Athens in the 5th century in particular. So here is how this is going to look for the paper. I'll be walking through the title of this paper, Autochthony, Indigeneity, and Coloniality in the Laws, very literally, to explain some of the concepts, contexts, and background that I'm hoping is going to be helpful in the discussion. So for instance, we'll cover what autochthony means for ancient Greeks. And as we move to indigeneity, we'll discuss concepts of it in the present, how it's being deployed in the ancient world, and also how it's being conceived of in Greece at the moment. Finally, I'll discuss colonialism in the context of not just Greece, but specifically in Plato's Laws. We'll look at some selected passages that explain the colonial project of what scholars typically call Plato's second best city, Magnesia, and its relationship to some of the concepts laid out in this past section. And then within this discussion, I'm going to trace out 2 potential routes to go for thinking with indigeneity in the ancient world, or at least in Platonic philosophy in the passages that I picked out. So route 1 takes very seriously the idea that we might find indigeneity useful to think with, and this helps us think through implications of colonialism in Athens. And route 2 follows Audra Simpson's version of ethnographic refusal. So what are some of the implications of refusing to look for indigeneity in the ancient Mediterranean, especially a refusal as an indigenous researcher? And like I said, these are going to be routes that are sketches, and I'm very much hoping we can find some new routes together. So beginning with autochthony, it's from the Greek autos, meaning self, and kathon, meaning soil, earth, or land. We might be familiar with this as a term used in the French language to describe indigenous people in general. And it's also a very specific term in ancient Greece, and especially for Athens. Athenians view themselves as autochthonous to Attica, but they're not the only people who have this founding myth. For instance, Thebans also have a different belief, and in contrast, there are other examples of Greeks who have stories of settlement. You can think of the Myrmidons here, who sort of wander around and then spring up in the area that they're in. So this myth of autochthony is deeply connected with views on citizenship, which we can trace directly to a change in citizenship laws by Pericles. Athenian citizens were required to have both parents be citizens, and with that additional requirement for citizenship, we see an emphasis on autochthony. Lepay argues that this moment shifts the concept of Athenian citizenship from belonging to us to belonging by descent, implying a racialized form of citizenship. So take, for instance, the following passage in the Menexenus, where Socrates gives a funeral oration he claims is written by Aspasia, the foreign wife of Pericles. Firstly, then, let us eulogize the nobility of birth, and secondly, their nurture and training. Thereafter, we shall exhibit the character of their exploits, how nobly and worthily they wrought them. Now, as regards nobility of birth, their first claim thereto is this: that the forefathers of these men were not of immigrant stock, nor were these their sons declared by their origin to be strangers in the land sprung from immigrants, but natives sprung from the soil living and dwelling in their own true fatherland, and nurtured also by no stepmother, like other folk, but by the mother country wherein they dwelt, which bare them and reared them, and now at their death receives them again to rest in their own abodes. I've chosen the quote first, as we'll see this appeal in several other dialogues, some of which are going to be discussed later. So for instance, we'll be looking at the Timaeus, but this myth of autochthony also very famously appears in the myth of the metals in the Republic. So if we want to think of autochthony as the Athenians having a sense of themselves on the basis of their land and quite literally springing up from this land, does this mean that we might want to think they're thinking in terms of indigeneity, or is it useful to think with some of these concepts? I do want to note first that there seems to be a firm understanding that whatever is going on with autochthony, like I said earlier, has a connection to race, that Athenians are themselves constructing a racial category based on descent and citizenship that's deeply specific to Athens. This makes a question of sort of a pan-Hellenic view of Greece very difficult. We can also find this, what we might call ethnocentrism and its connection to the land and autochthony as operative and integral in certain Platonic texts. So take the Timaeus, a dialogue most known for giving us the cosmological landscape of Plato's forms, also extends the autochthony metaphor to the mythical Athenians who will eventually take on and cause the fall of the empire Atlantis, a true story which the character Critias is repeating from his paternal grandfather, and this will tell the story of Solon's travels to Egypt, which he makes before the laws of Athens are made, and the Egyptians tell him the true origin story of Athens. So in this first quote, he's told, "All this order and system the goddess had bestowed upon you," the goddess being Athena, "earlier when she founded your society, choosing the place in which you were born because she saw the well-tempered climate would bear a crop of men of high intelligence. Being a lover of war and wisdom, the goddess chose out the region that would bear men closely resembling herself, and there made her first settlement." Note that the goddess Athena is literally planting the seeds of the soon-to-be Athenians in Attica because it has the best crop and conditions to nurture the traits that she wants to have her future Athenian citizens have. We see this repeated in a dialogue that's associated with the Timaeus, which is called the Critias, because Critias is telling the story, which functions as an expansion of the Athens-Atlantis myth. And here we get told now, in other regions, others of the gods had their allotments and ordered the affairs, but inasmuch as Hephaestus and Athena were of a like nature, being born of the same father and agreeing, moreover, in their love of wisdom and of craftsmanship, they took both for their joint portion this land of ours as being naturally congenial and adapted for virtue and for wisdom. And therein they planted, as native to the soil, men of virtue and ordained their minds to the mode of government. So contrast this to the last passage, autochthony is really emphasized with the word appearing in the Greek. The Critias version of the story goes a step further by cementing the supremacy of Athenians against other Greeks as well as Europe and Asia. Quote, "So it was that these men, being themselves of the character described and always justly administering in some such fashion both their own land and Hellas, were famous throughout all Europe and Asia, both for their bodily beauty and for the perfection of their moral excellence, were all of the men then living the most renowned." So, do we think we might want to call the Athenians indigenous? Do we think Plato might want to call the Athenians indigenous? And what does that do for us? So I want to contrast with a quote from V.F. Cordova's book, How It Is, where she says, "If at the beginning of the colonization of the Americas, there's no such thing as a singular notion of all indigenous peoples being Indians, there's now such a thing. This has come about through the fact that Native Americans find that despite forced attempts to assimilate them conceptually as well as physically, they have more in common with other indigenous groups, regardless of their obvious differences, than they do with the conceptual framework of the European colonizer." What I want to try to draw out here is that there is a focus on negotiating identities. And while this passage specifically focuses on the term Indian and indigenous to make the various tribes legible to European colonizers, do we also risk that sort of erasure in trying to make indigeneity visible in ancient Athens? Do we risk sort of the same things? And I've also previously thought with this passage in an upcoming chapter on the Cambridge Companion to Race and Classics on indigeneity. There, however, I was considering the negotiation of indigeneity, but looking at specifically Las Casas and his In Defense and how he attempts to ameliorate indigenous people outside of the category of barbarian. But what's different in this case, however, than I think thinking about sort of the barbarian definition of indigenous people that we get in the early modern period, is that it's not clear that autochthonous Athenians are necessarily the opposite of barbarians, but that what Plato wants us to think is that it gives autochthonous Athenians a special status against the whole of Greeks as well as the whole of barbarians. So it's a more exclusive hierarchy and ideology when he's deploying these autochthony myths. So we might further add to some of these issues if we consider how the term is being applied in Greece, especially the term indigeneity. So Yannis Hamalakis, a Greek archaeologist, has developed an idea of indigenous archaeology in Greece. And here I'm not really differentiating between lowercase indigenous and uppercase indigenous, but I think maybe in the discussion period it might be helpful if we thought about if this distinction would sort of clear things up. But in his work, The Nation and Its Ruins, Antiquity, Archaeology, and National Imagination in Greece, he traces a path from the imagined and distant world of ancient Greece to its role in the nation and state building in the immediate aftermath of the Greek independence movement in the mid-19th century. And first, what I wanted to look at is this quote he offers on what ancient Greece does in the Western imagination and the caution. But classical Greece, of course, is not only Greek. In fact, classical Greece in its various reincarnations and forms, from architecture to literature and from advertising to company architecture, is everywhere in the Western world. The very mention of the name Greece in global academic and popular encounters evokes notions of classical antiquity, and indeed the names of Greece and of Greeks themselves will denote primarily classical antiquity, hence the need to very often add the pre-modern in order to note the present-day country and its people, a revealing and highly charged linguistic device. Greece is at the same time a country and a topos in Western imagination, a reality and a myth, a national property, and a Western international claim. Therein lies a key paradox of this phenomenon, a source of tensions, of ambiguities, of contradictions, of ambivalent feelings, and of clashes. He then goes to show how some of these Western notions of Greece, and specifically British claims on Greece as an identity, and then what an indigenous view of Greece looks like in the 19th and early 20th century. So he writes, the indigenous Hellenism that has dominated the national imagination since then is a semi-religious, sacred, messianic dogma that celebrated its emancipation from Western Europe, but which could not hide its conservatism and its castigation of all descendant views as anti-Greek or anti-Hellenikes, a term that first appeared at this time and acquired increasing currency in the following decades and centuries. So hopefully this gives us some of the context and some of the impact for thinking about indigeneity in the ancient world and ancient Athens, particularly as it's a powerful space for Greek notions of indigeneity today. So given that we can see indigeneity as being thought with already in the ancient world, and that this world in itself relies on contested notions of belonging, both in the sense of autochthony and in the sense of who the classical past belongs to, we might start to put the last pieces of the puzzle together and think about colonialism. What does colonialism look like in ancient Athens? We might think of Athens in the Peloponnesian War, strong-arming other policies, but its colonial ambitions extend from its imperial power as well as changes how it acts as a colonial power. So as starting a colony, it would often revolve around establishing a charter. In part, that charter documented how the laws of the city-state would transfer over to the new state, but also involved specific religious aspects. So that meant quite literally taking over the city's old god and planting in the ground as a means of imbuing the new colony with the remnants of the establishing city-state. We can then think of this process as putting people in a new place, but in a way that is extremely connected with the original city that it's belonged with. And it also involved taking over lands from original inhabitants. So here we have the Oxford Classical Dictionary entry on the effects of Greek colonialism. This says, in general, the effects of Greek settlement on native populations were considerable, starting with the extermination or submission of indigenous people in the case of violent occupation of land by Greek settlers. In other cases, however, a balance of power or friendly relationships allowed considerable human mobility towards both the new centers on the coast and the indigenous centers of the interior, including intermarriages, exiles, traders, and craftsmen. This all led to different forms of cultural interaction between Greeks and indigenous people that are reflected in the archaeological record. For a lot of reasons, I think when we get to the passages of the laws, there's a lot to push back on against how Greek colonization is sort of reflected. And while the archaeological records might show contact, it doesn't quite show marginalization or subalternality, which has sort of been explored by Irad Melkin in many of his works. So this brings us to the laws, one of the last dialogues written by Plato. It follows three interlocutors who are on a walk up to Mount Ida in Crete to the cave where Zeus was born. The interlocutors are representative of three of the major city-states, Crete, that's Clinias, Sparta, Megalus, and an unnamed Athenian labeled the Athenian stranger. The three of them get into a discussion of the aim of their own laws, their own origins, and the status of education in a city. Eventually, Clinias admits that he has been asked to found a new colony for Crete. I make no secret of you of what has befallen me. More, I count it to be a sign of heaven. The most part of Crete is undertaking to found a colony, and it was given charge of the undertaking to the Cnossians, and the city of Knossos was entrusted to me, and 9 others were bidden also to frame laws, choosing as we please either from our own local laws or from those of other countries, taking no exception to their alien character, provided only that they seem superior. The rest of the dialogue will revolve around the construction of the colony, which will be labeled Magnesia. This project becomes an instance of building an ideal city-state in the same vein as what we get in the Republic with the Callipolis, although this city that is built is Plato's second best city. And one reason we might think of it as a second best is that unlike in our stories about Athens from the Timaeus and Critias, we do not get to pretend that there's any autochthony here. The citizens are not from the land, and therefore they don't get the benefits laid out of what autochthony is supposed to promise. Also note that this will be a Cretan city, not an Athenian city, which adds additional weight to what we're considering here. Despite the fact it's not Athenian, the stranger is not pessimistic about the prospect for the colony. Instead, he asks for additional details about its location, and finding that it's a small island not near other city-states, says the following: then it should not be incurably unfit for the acquisition of virtue, for the sea is in very truth a right briny and bitter neighbor. Although there is sweetness in the proximity for the uses of daily life, for filling the markets of the city with foreign merchandise and retail trading, and breeding in men's souls knavish and tricky ways, it renders the city faithless and loveless, not to itself only, but to the rest of the world as well. So I want to emphasize here is that there's a concern with the virtue of citizens and also a deep concern with keeping this second best city and specifically colonized, isolated from other populations and groups of people. So the last aspect I want to draw to point to in the laws is precisely on this question of how the lawgiver will guide its citizens to virtue. And special attention is paid to the existing character of possible citizens, and the Athenian stranger makes the following statements. So examples of this we can see today in the effect produced on the Egyptians and Phoenicians and many other nations by the liberal character of their property and their other institutions, whether these results are due to their having a bad lawgiver or to some adverse misfortune that befell them or else to some natural disadvantage. For that too is a point. Some districts are naturally superior to others for the breeding of men of a good or bad type, and we must not conflict with this natural difference in our legislation. And then he says, of all these, those districts would be by far the best, which have a kind of heavenly breeze, and where the portions of land are under the care of daimons, so that they receive those that come from time to time to settle there either graciously or ungraciously. So we might recall what we saw in the Timaeus and Critias, the emphasis on a divine and daimonic placement going hand in hand with a relationship to the land. And while in Timaeus and Critias, unlike in the laws, they tell a mythical story of the founding of Athens, it's not a story of colonization necessarily. However, when we look at different Critias passages, which we could explore next, there is an emphasis on divine winds and gods placing their allotted people onto lands, which for some scholars emphasizes that Critias is meant to be read as a charter myth and a sort of proto-level of colonization. And finally, we can see a racial connection here. Lots of people discuss this passage in relationship to race, especially because of the mention of Egyptians and Phoenicians. What might be hard to disentangle is if we want to read this passage through an indigenous lens, what might come out of some of these mentions. So some final thoughts. There's a lot of context for things. Hopefully people are feeling ready to discuss them. So autochthony as a key foundational myth for Athenians, and the repetition of this myth in Platonic dialogues, that there's perhaps a complicated notion of indigeneity happening here. Specifically, do we want to call the Athenians indigenous? And if we do, what does that look like? So I'll circle back to my two routes. So route one would look like engaging with and taking seriously Athenians' claims to being sprung from the land. And questions that would come up would be, what does it mean to make this claim? But also extend it to an imperial and colonial power. Could that help us disentangle some of Homoloucus's initial claims about the contested imaginative space that is classical Athens? As in the myth Timaeus and the imagined city in the law shows us, Athens is a key imaginative space in the ancient world as well as in the modern. We might find a concept of indigeneity that looks not like our own, but helps us trace where power dynamics might come into place. And here I'm thinking about Vine Delora Jr. and Daniel Wildcat's power and place, especially the formula power plus place equals personality. So something like that might be helpful, and also it might be helpful to trace out histories of philosophy that both Wildcat and Deloria have in this book. And then route two would look like a refusal to use or seek forms of indigeneity in the ancient world. And here I've quoted Audra Simpson's development of the form of refusal as an ethnographic one. So Simpson critiques what she calls the anthropological need to salvage and document the indigenous past without considering the multiple sovereignties at stakes. And the quote of "enough is certainly enough" is how she phrases her own refusals in writing out ethnographic interviews. So could this help us as possibly indigenous scholars in classics? I want to note that this doesn't mean that I don't think there's any value in placing critical indigenous studies or methodologies and thinking with the classical world, but more does this help us shape how we want to investigate indigeneity in the Mediterranean, full stop, if we're leaning on ethnographies of refusal rather than sort of the imaginative and clashing space that is Athens and the myths. And we also might look at other applications of refusals. So for instance, Bonnie Honig's feminist series of refusals traces out those acts of refusal and defiance in Greek tragedy. There might also be a way to read and look for refusals in Platonic dialogues themselves, and if that's also helpful in deploying indigenous methodologies in a slightly different way. So I'm looking forward to talking about some of the different routes. Happy to answer questions. I have some extra passages. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, cool. Wait. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Hi. Thank you so much. That was lovely and really interesting and exciting work. I think something I found myself wondering about is in so many of the passages you draw out, there's a kind of connection between what we're calling indigeneity for the sake of this conversation right now, and supremacy and the inaction of violence. And I guess I was just curious. I just wanted to hear what you thought or felt about that, and kind of like encountering these where, right, like these narratives of, the Athenians sprang up from the soil and they're better than everyone else, or like, and like, just like how, I'm just really interested in thinking or staying with that a little bit more. But thank you, this is really exciting work.
Thank you so much. So I've thought a little bit about how these autochthony myths in Plato and their connection to supremacy, often at the end of these myths, they lead to a sort of apocalypse. And so one way that I've thought about this is with Nick Estes' Our Past is Your Future, and the sort of no dapple protest, and the sort of idea of the black snake, and that being an apocalyptic myth, but an apocalyptic myth that helps revitalize and resist settler colonial occupation. And the autochthony myths that we get in Plato do the opposite of that. Rather than form a basis of resistance, they form a basis of conservatism and sort of exclusivity. So I find that contrast to be really interesting. And then this is, I mean, the Timaeus and the Atlantis story, it's going to have a very long history in sort of white supremacist circles, where white supremacists are constantly trying to say that sort of their people are the Atlanteans, which is also really weird because the Atlanteans aren't even like the supremely good people in the story. So it's both a misreading and a sort of violent use of some of these texts, but yeah.
Hi, Ashley. Thank you. Thank you so much. I was really, really struck by Athena coming in and bending the will, her will, nature's bending nature to her will. And this is like a trope that comes a lot in the early modern period and in texts that are read as Neoplatonic and kind of panegyrics. They're not doing ideological work. And if you can tell us more about this act of a goddess bending the will of nature and having that power.
Yeah, thank you. So this is going to sound very philosopher of me, and I'm sorry. But so I take it that the idea of nature that we have in the Timaeus is not one where nature has a separate will from the gods, but that the way that the world has been built and constructed cosmologically is such that nature, the gods, and divinity all come together for a teleological purpose, and humans fulfill part of that teleological purpose. So in the Timaeus dialogue, when we get the actual cosmology story, Timaeus says that the demiurge creates sort of the infinite, the three things that matter, basically, being stable and the same. And then he constructs the lesser gods in a sort of mimesis of them and instructs them to create humans. So in this way, it's Athena working with her nature to do what she's been told to do by the divine creator of the universe, which I think is a really interesting story at a cosmological level.
My question references Jamie also. So in light of what you were just telling us, I'm really curious, several of the passages you gave us mention agriculture, like the tillage of the soil, and that just seems like a really interesting metaphor. It's a different way of talking about nature that involves kind of human intervention that looks, I imagine, very different for the Athenians, say, than in the early Americas. What do you make of the fact that that is the metaphor that's chosen? And tell us about farming. But especially because this was something that Jamie had mentioned about ways of living in cooperation with the land.
Yeah.
And this one is really interesting to me.
Okay, this is perfect because I actually put an extra passage. So let me. I think it's this one. There's 3 extra of these, but I don't think we'll get to all of them. So I think, does this say laws at the bottom? Okay, so this is a really bizarre passage where in the laws, before they start building the new colony of Magnesia, the Athenian stranger tells a story of how the world is made and that it's cycles of creation and destruction. And he gives this sort of anthropological explanation of the people who have managed to continue persisting in the face of sort of, he talks mostly in terms of environmental catastrophes. So flooding and earthquakes. And it's specifically these farmers and herders that he views as the sort of seeds for the next cycle of the population. So it's almost sort of like tautological, where the farming metaphors are built into the beginning, and there's almost not a way to imagine the world without it, which I find to be, extremely interesting. And I should also note that along with the farming metaphors, there's just a lot of metaphors of sort of seed and soil, along with the more specialized farming language for tilling. So there's like sort of 2 different levels of the agricultural metaphor happening.
Hi, I want to ask a kind of naive question. I'm thinking about sort of what's the relationship between autochthony and parthenogenesis? So like if the Athenians are like, we come from the soil, do you think it's also a way of sort of connecting to this sort of mythological virgin that pops up from her dad's head and like makes this kind of nice, it creates a creation story that creates a people within a city so that it can do these things?
Yeah, thank you. I don't have this on my selected bibliography, but Nicole Leroy, who's a French classicist, she has a book called Athena's Children, and she writes exactly about this relationship between Athena popping out of Zeus's head and then Athenian male citizens popping out of the ground, and she writes mostly from a feminist perspective about the gendered implications of sort of erasing women as being able to create Athenian citizenship, which is quite interesting. But yeah, I would recommend. It's from the 80s, so it's a bit old, but it's kind of a good starting point. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Thank you. That was wonderful, and I appreciate that you have extra slides just in case.
Thanks.
I want to come back to the capital I, small I distinction with indigeneity. And I want to because I think a lot of white nationalists are starting to claim the ancient past as their indigenous past. Mm-hmm. But of course, they don't want any rights or responsibilities that come with that. They just want to say, look, everyone's indigenous, therefore nobody gets rights. And I want to do that through the metaphor of planting. Because if the Athenians are planted, typically that's a colonial metaphor that implies planted over something, right? Even Athena, she's coming out of Zeus's head. Zeus exists before, and she comes, right? In other words, I guess what I'm wondering is, does the metaphor of planting the Athenians actually imply a lack of indigeneity, a sense that they are transplants into the land?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about that. And I also think that would sort of work quite well with the route two in a sort of method of refusal. So if one part of refusal is that actually what we're seeing in these passages is not a spontaneous sort of generation of springing up from the land, but a sort of intentional transplantation into it. And then that's also a refusal of letting sort of white supremacist narratives sort of take over to space. Yeah, I really like that. Thank you.
I wasn't sure if you were including this among the apocalyptic element that you talked about earlier, but I was wondering about the autonomous element of Thebes, like the origin story of Thebes, where you also have this idea of planting the seeds of humanity, but there it has sort of the opposite implication, right, where it's like a self-destroying dynamic that then gets projected into the future in the Oedipal cycle, so I wondered about how that sort of fits into using autochthony as a way to think about indigeneity. This sort of particular counterexample where there's a sort of self-canceling violence and destruction that comes from being in your own space. And I actually kind of wonder about this in relation to your question about the problem, because it does seem like one of the difficulties of talking about indigeneity now in a lot of political contexts is precisely that because its definition is contested, it makes it very hard to use it as a thing that's actually supposed to establish rights to freedom and thriving for people who are there. And so I wondered if the sort of the counterexample of Thebes is a way of sort of talking about that problem of defining indigeneity, or how it sort of fits into your argument.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're so right. It's a good counterexample. I also, I thought to bring up that the sort of status of Athenians as autochthonous is also sort of contested. So I think Herodotus has a passage where he has a story of Athenians coming to be not from the land, but from sort of wandering, which is a more typical Greek origin narrative. And there it's interesting, Herodotus is definitely not Athenian. So what are different claims to origin stories outside of Athens? So for instance, the Theban or even the Spartan origin story. And then what are non-Athenians saying about the origins of sort of Athens as a sort of fuller picture of what autochthony does or doesn't do for claims, maybe of indigeneity, maybe of just belonging to the land.
Thank you so much. Actually, that was fantastic. Can you join me in thanking her?